In the interest of time, we will start. Dear colleagues, friends, you are all welcome to this afternoon to this Arria Formula meeting on the topic of enhancing the capacities of member states to ensure a gender-responsive approach to counter-terrorism. Malta is delighted to hold this meeting alongside our co-sponsors, Costa Rica, Jordan, Mexico, Mozambique, New Zealand, Spain, and the United States. This cross-regional group underscores the importance of the topic for all member states in comprehensively addressing the threat posed by terrorism and violent extremism. I want to welcome our 4 briefers today, as well as our fellow council members. In addition, I am delighted at the level of interest in this meeting from other UN member states, who are all very welcome. Finally, I would like to extend a warm welcome to the UN Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism and Human Rights, as well as other UN entities, including those from the Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact, and, of course, representatives of civil society present with us today. Colleagues, Malta is of the firm view that efforts to counter terrorism and prevent violent extremism are most effective when they respect human rights and promote gender equality. Today's meeting will consider the importance of building the capacity of member states to ensure gender-responsive approaches to preventing and countering terrorism and violent extremism. In this regard, we hope this meeting will be a practical and constructive one, where we identify the challenges experienced in mainstreaming gender in counter-terrorism responses and the capacity needs of member states in this area. We also hope to highlight good practices and capacity-building supports available to member states in ensuring gender-responsive approaches with a particular focus on criminal justice responses. Finally, we want to reflect on what more this Council, and indeed the General Assembly, can do to realize the goal of gender-responsive counterterrorism. We feel this is a very timely discussion, particularly after the recent adoption of the 8th review of the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy. In this regard, I want to extend my congratulations to the co-facilitators, Canada and Tunisia, present here today, for all their work in securing a consensual outcome. Before passing the floor to our briefers, I want to make some quick housekeeping announcements as to how we will manage the meeting today. Our briefers will speak first, followed by council members. We will then hear from our co-sponsors, followed by group statements, the UN Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism and Human Rights, and then other UN member states. I want to encourage all speakers to be brief. We have allocated 7 minutes to our briefers, and we ask all others to limit their interventions to 3 minutes. Before closing, and if time allows, we hope to return the floor to our briefers for some final reflections. So, without any further ado, I will hand the floor to our first speaker today, Sarah Hendricks, the Deputy Executive Director ad interim for Policy Program, Civil Society and Intergovernmental Support at UN Women. As colleagues know, UN Women is the United Nations entity dedicated to gender equality and the empowerment of women, and is chair of the Global Counterterrorism Compact Working Group on Gender. Deputy Executive Director Hendricks, I welcome you. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and distinguished ambassadors and fellow panelists. I certainly hope that you all have had an opportunity to read the report of the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Afghanistan. This was published just less than 2 weeks ago. And in this report, the Special Rapporteur lists more than 50 edicts restricting women's rights issued by the Taliban between September of 2021 and May of 2023. And it describes in it the systematic oppression of Afghan women as gender apartheid. Afghanistan may be the most extreme example of this particular brand of cruelty, but the intention of subjugating women and erasing them from public life is part of the global nature of terrorism and is part and central to its tactics, to its narratives, to its ideologies. What we are seeing in Afghanistan is already being emulated by other armed groups and by political actors across other countries. Across borders, these groups share in common their commitment to deny women and girls their most basic rights, and the deliberate and strategic manipulation of gender norms and stereotypes fundamentally to serve those ends. The multilateral system is being strained by the proliferation and certainly by the escalation of crises. We all know that. The topic that we're here for today is yet another front line in which our credibility is being tested and is falling short. And I'd like to provide a few examples in this regard. First, in the recent years of the Security Council, the most frequent mentions of women and girls in discussions of international terrorism, beyond the generic calls for gender mainstreaming or for women's participation, refer to three emblematic cases. The first one is the mass abduction of girls in the Lake Chad Basin and the Sahel, starting with the Chibok schoolgirls who made so many global headlines now back in 2014. You may have seen the reports from just a couple of months ago that some of them are still being rescued. They were teenagers when they were abducted, and they are now 26 years old. 9 years after their abduction, about a third of them are still in captivity. And thousands of girls have been kidnapped since in the broader region, teeming with more terrorist groups now than then, and tens of millions of children are out of school altogether because of insecurity. The second example that I'll draw from is the plight of the Yazidi women. Earlier this month, Nobel Peace Prize laureate Nadia Murad announced the rescue of 6 more women who were also girls when taken captive about 9 years ago. Half of the Yazidi that were abducted are actually still missing, and many of those that have been freed linger in IDP camps, very much still awaiting assistance. And the third one is the situation of tens of thousands of women and children in detention camps in Syria. Year after year, and update after update, in spite of the many reports about the inhumane conditions and the widespread violence in these camps, the number of women and children in Al-Hol and other detention camps barely moves down. There is this slow trickle of repatriations. Those are some of the cases that certainly get the most attention by the Security Council, and they show, I think, once again, the significant gap between the language in the resolutions, the very ambitious language in our speeches, and the results on the ground. There's a massive chasm between those two things. There are also other examples to take note of. The atrocities committed by ISIS are among the most thoroughly investigated and documented in history. But the first conviction of an ISIS member for genocide of the Yazidi did not take place until 2021 and confirmed just earlier this year. Another example, the UN Sanctions Committee covering al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other terrorist groups does not include a listing criterion related to women's rights or to sexual and gender-based violence. And the reports of the monitoring team are often lacking of information, but also especially of analysis in these areas. Funding, as always, is always a problem. In spite of the vast sums of money devoted to both military spending and counterterrorism. One of the most often cited examples of gender parity in efforts to rehabilitate and reintegrate people associated with terrorist groups is Somalia's national program for the treatment and the handling of disengaged combatants. This, of course, is supported by the UN. And for years, this program has been supporting a similar number of women and men in centers for low-risk defectors of al-Shabaab, showing significant improvements in their education, improvements in their livelihoods, in their mental well-being, in their civic engagement. And yet, this program gets a lot of mentions in New York, but struggles to get funding. It had to close its center in Mogadishu, and it can only serve a fraction of the women who would benefit from its assistance. And finally, an example in 2015, the Secretary General proposed that the 15% funding target for gender equality as a principal objective be applied to all projects to address new peace and security threats. This includes, of course, violent extremism. To our knowledge, this minimum has never been reached, and very few can really track precisely after many years of discussion about methodologies. There has been, nonetheless, some progress, especially at the normative level. Since the adoption of Resolution 2242 in 2015, there has been a noticeable increase in gender-related recommendations to member states by the Counter-Terrorism Committee Executive Directorate. UN Women has supported this by participating in more than 10 of their expert assessments and by collaborating in the Gender Working Group of the Counter-Terrorism Coordination Compact. There has also been exponential growth in research on this area. That's a good thing, including, importantly, on misogyny, on toxic masculinity, as drivers of terrorism across ideologies. We need and must learn more by evidence and research in these areas. Further, we have tried to do a better job of integrating the prevention of violent extremism into national action plans on women, peace, and security, and conversely, to integrate women, peace, and security considerations into national strategies to counter terrorism. We've done this in Pakistan, where UN Women has partnered with the National Counterterrorism Authority to address gender issues in response to the surge in terrorism and in violent extremism that has followed the Taliban takeover in neighboring Afghanistan. We've also done this in Jordan, where the National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security includes a dedicated goal, a specific dedicated goal on gender-responsive prevention of violent extremism, with funds, importantly, allocated to its implementation, and is already reporting positive results. These are good stories. In many places, furthermore, we keep partnering with women's organizations to engage in peace infrastructure at all levels, including especially at the community level, such as in the Horn of Africa or in the Sahel, where UN Women supports both state institutions and civil society in the implementation of the AU Regional Stabilization Strategy and the UN Integrated Strategy for the Sahel. These are all positive steps, but they do not reflect the ambitions and aspirations of our normative commitments or women peace builders. And unfortunately, they are not enough to turn the tide. To turn that tide that threatens to set back the cause of gender equality, and to turn the tide that threatens the cause of peace. Instead, what is painfully evident is that our efforts to reform security actors have only begun to scratch the surface. And these gender considerations are too often an afterthought for the main actors driving counterterrorism and countering violent extremism. Women are still not meaningfully involved in all stages of decision-making or significantly included and represented in security institutions. Many of our initiatives involving women are tokenistic, or they tend to remain at the margins of policy, at the margins of practice. And at best, women are consulted, often without financial consultation or, compensation for their expertise, and consequently largely ignored. At worst, women are instrumentalized. Or at very worst, they're put in danger or become the target of counterterrorism laws that are misused to obstruct the work of civil society activists. Meanwhile, the global threat of terrorism continues to be high, and women's rights remain starkly under attack. And as long as women continue getting sidelined from decision-making and impunity prevails for these crimes against women, we really cannot expect much change for the better. We do look forward to hearing everyone's ideas for a change in direction that is so desperately needed. And with this, thank you so much for listening. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next briefer is Alexandra Deer, Gender Coordinator with the Counterterrorism Committee Executive Directorate. CTED carries out the policy decisions of the Counterterrorism Committee and both conducts assessments of and facilitates technical assistance to member states. CTED is also the Vice Chair of the Global Compact Working Group on Gender. Ms. Deer, we thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Many thanks. Madam Chair, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, it has been almost 8 years since the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2242, which called for better integration of the women, peace and security and counterterrorism agendas, and gave CTED its mandate to mainstream gender across its activities. Since then, a robust and growing evidence base has indisputably established that gender matters in the context of countering terrorism. Integrating gender is a necessity both from a rights-based and from an operational perspective. However, there continues to be a lack of implementation of gender-sensitive counterterrorism measures that do not have adverse gender and human rights impacts and do not perpetuate gender stereotypes or gender inequality. In CTED's dialogue with member states, their lack of adequate capacity is frequently cited as an impediment to the development and implementation of more gender-sensitive counterterrorism measures. It is therefore very timely to hold this Arria Formula meeting to reflect on key capacity-building needs. As part of its core mandate to provide neutral expert assessments of member states' implementation of Security Council resolutions on counterterrorism, CTED makes recommendations on how to address gaps in implementation and capacity. In this regard, we have seen, as was already referred to, both an overall increase in the number of gender-related recommendations made to member states, as well as inclusion of gender considerations across all thematic areas covered in our assessments, including legal and criminal justice issues, law enforcement and border management, countering the financing of terrorism, information and communications technology, and CVE. We look forward to continuing to liaise with our partners to ensure that there is uptake of these recommendations by technical assistance providers. While the particular capacity-building needs of member states vary, I would like to highlight 3 overarching trends that we see in our assessments. First, the systematic collection of gender disaggregated data is still not the norm. This makes it very difficult to track developments, understand the challenges, and implement tailored, gender-sensitive policy responses. An illustration of this was the severe lack of data on the large number of women who traveled under varying circumstances to join ISIL in Syria and Iraq, and the subsequent challenges in tracking and preparing for their return. Second, we continue to note the lack of robust monitoring and evaluation of the gender and human rights impacts of counterterrorism and CVE measures and programs. Ensuring this kind of monitoring and evaluation is essential to correcting any shortcomings and identifying lessons learned and good practices. The third trend is that gender is still overwhelmingly being treated as synonymous with women. There is limited to no attention being paid to masculinities and structural gender inequality in counterterrorism and CVE. This is despite the growing evidence base on the relevance of these issues for how terrorist groups recruit and operate, and how gender inequality can contribute to the conditions conducive to terrorism. Building on the analytical work that we have done in this area, CTAD looks forward to engaging with member states on how to operationalize these considerations in counterterrorism and CVE measures and prevention strategies. Given the focus of today's meeting on gender-responsive criminal justice approaches, I would like to highlight some of the more specific gaps and capacity needs in this area. In its engagement with member states on behalf of the Counterterrorism Committee, CTAD continues to observe considerable challenges faced by states in ensuring that acts of sexual and gender-based violence committed in terrorism contexts are duly investigated and prosecuted in line with member states' obligations under international law, and that survivor-centered and gender-responsive support is made available. Despite the global condemnation of this phenomenon, including by this Council, there remains very limited progress in efforts to ensure accountability for sexual and gender-based violence committed in terrorism contexts. Challenges affecting meaningful accountability for SGBV in terrorism contexts include gaps in understanding of how to apply relevant legal frameworks, including counterterrorism frameworks, international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and international criminal law, and of the interlinkages between them. Member states also face practical challenges relating to the investigation, prosecution, and adjudication of sexual and gender-based violence, including with respect to evidence collection and evidence sharing, the development of prosecutorial strategies, and victim and witness participation in criminal proceedings, as well as aspects pertaining to institutional capacity and cooperation. To assist member states in addressing these legal and practical challenges and in meeting their international legal obligations to bring to justice individuals who have committed or supported terrorist acts, CTAD is currently engaged in a project with the support of the government of Switzerland on advancing meaningful accountability for SGBV in terrorism contexts, and we will be publishing a study including relevant recommendations in the coming months. Madam Chair, in conclusion, as the discussed examples demonstrate, gender is a genuinely cross-cutting and intersectional perspective, not a single issue. It requires systematic inclusion at all stages of the policy process and across all thematic areas of counterterrorism and CVE practice. And that, in turn, requires having the necessary capacities and thus resources. Ultimately, it therefore requires political will. Without the commitment to invest in this area, we will continue to pay lip service to the importance of gender mainstreaming in counterterrorism while lagging behind in actual implementation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next briefer is Mr. Stephen Hill, Executive Director of the International Institute for Justice and the Rule of Law. Malta is proud to host the IIJ, an international training institute which delivers capacity-building support to criminal justice practitioners in several regions to effectively address terrorism within a human rights and rule of law framework. Mr. Hill is back with us in New York today after having briefed the Counter-Terrorism Committee only 10 days ago. Mr. Hill, the floor is yours.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Excellence.
Thank you, Madam President. Excellencies, Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank the chair of this meeting, Her Excellency Vanessa Fraser, Permanent Representative to the UN of the Republic of Malta, for the opportunity to brief you today on the topic of enhancing capacities I'm a member of the IIJ.
Of the 3 Global Counterterrorism Forum inspired institutions, our mandate, as you said, is to provide rule of law-based capacity building, working with lawmakers, police, prosecutors, judges, corrections officials, and other criminal justice practitioners to provide rule of law and human rights-based approaches to addressing terrorism and related transnational organized crime. We work to strengthen criminal justice systems and to build regional judicial police and other criminal justice networks to promote justice, security, and human rights. Our work is technical and non-political and emphasizes the good practices of the GCTF, as well as the relevant Security Council resolutions pertaining to counterterrorism. We work primarily in all regions of Africa, as well as the MENA region and Southeast Asia. We regularly work with UN partners such as CTED, UNODC, UNOCT, and the OHCHR. As Executive Secretary, I have the privilege to lead the 30-person IAJ Secretariat, which is a multinational team based in Malta with staff members from over 20 nationalities, including from countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Since its inception in 2014, the IAJ has worked with over 8,000 participants from 125 countries. In 2022, we organized 27 capacity building activities with a wide range of thematic and geographical areas of focus. We worked with a total of 905 practitioners. Some data, 33% of these were women, and 67% were men. So whilst gender parity is an important goal for this organization, we clearly have much more work to do in this area. What does the IAJ do? Our work consists of shorter thematic programs as well as longer courses. By way of the shorter programs, we have active workshops on the issue of foreign terrorist fighters, including from the Al-Hol camp, workshops on reinforcing different specialized aspects of the criminal justice approach to counterterrorism, workshops on how best to use mutual legal assistance requests. For example, this week we'll begin a workshop in Tanzania that's focused on the needs of practitioners from Malawi, Mozambique, and Tanzania in the mutual legal assistance space. We also work on the issue of battlefield information, as well as the issue of terrorism financing and politically motivated violent extremism. One of our newer initiatives, it's worth mentioning in this space, relates to addressing impunity for sexual violence in the context of terrorism, which my CTED colleague has just spoke about. We have a program that focuses on primarily on Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, and Daesh in this regard. We have so far offered 3 regional programs on the investigation and prosecution of sexual violence that's linked to terrorism, working together with UNODC, with the Denis Mukwege Foundation, with the Special Tribunal in the Central African Republic, and a range of other specialists on the matter. We gathered criminal justice practitioners, just as an example of what we do, in Burkina Faso, then in Malawi and in Uganda, to understand the unique challenges associated with investigating and prosecuting crimes of sexual violence in the context of terrorism. As I mentioned, we also conduct longer form intensive foundational training for senior and mid-level counterterrorism actors. These are most frequently prosecutors and investigators. And in this, we use a peer-to-peer approach that is centered and driven by the needs expressed by the practitioners themselves. These courses seek to improve prosecutorial and investigative capacity. They cover topics such as crime scene management, internal coordination amongst practitioners within the national legal systems, formal and informal means of international legal cooperation, and victim and witness protection. Our capacity building activities are subject to results-based monitoring and evaluation, which aims, among other things, to ensure that gender is fully integrated into all aspects of our work, and this is one of our prime objectives. Recently, our staff was part of the steering committee of the EU-funded project on women and counterterrorism implemented by the Women in International Security in Brussels. This project was initiated to formulate guidance and tools aimed at increasing the participation of women in the criminal justice response to terrorism. This is in line with our goal to mainstream gender considerations in the substance of our work and to ensure the full participation of women practitioners in our activities. As mentioned, our work is centered in the needs of practitioners expressed by those practitioners. We have a network of approximately 8,000 alumni practitioners, and we have recently completed a survey of those alumni, which is designed to identify subjects that would be most helpful for them in their work. It's interesting in the context of this meeting to report that the survey identified issues related to gender as one of the principal concerns of our 8,000 alumni, which is an interesting point. Let me just convey a few other points that we've picked up in the context of working with our various alumni that highlight why gender mainstreaming and counterterrorism is a significant issue and one which we tend to continue to work on. First of all, from the perspective of victims. It's well documented that not all citizens are equally at risk to various aspects of terrorism, and not all are able to recover from attacks, especially the most vulnerable, where women and girls are often overrepresented. Thus, a gender-sensitive approach is essential to vindicate the complex needs of victims in criminal justice processes. The second point that we consistently hear from our alumni is that mainstreaming gender can have a positive impact on operational responses, as my colleague from CTED has just said. Specifically in the context of criminal justice, breaking down and indeed eliminating gender stereotypes can yield a clearer and more accurate picture for operational officials, such as investigators, as they work to identify perpetrators and inciters of terrorist acts. For example, reflexively relying on outmoded gender stereotypes, commonly deeming males as aggressors and perpetrators alone, can obscure highly relevant intelligence and investigative information which might not conform to an old stereotype. And this is clearly an undesirable consequence. So in addition to equity and fundamental fairness, gender mainstreaming is sound policy and can work towards enhancing the security of the international community. And that's backed up by what we hear from the people we worked with. And so let me just conclude by saying that we will continue and indeed redouble our efforts to mainstream gender in our work, and all of the staff of the IAJ and I are committed to this goal. And we'd like to just finish by thanking you, Madam Ambassador, for all of the support provided by Malta in our work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our final briefer this afternoon is Fawzia Ali, President of Women in International Security, Horn of Africa. She is a devoted advocate for women peace builders in peace and security efforts across the Horn of Africa, chairing a network of women peace builders, Sisters Without Borders, which has steadily grown in membership from Kenya to other countries in the region. Malta firmly believes that council action is more effective when it heeds the voices of civil society. Ms. Ali, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Your Excellencies, distinguished ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, and good afternoon as well to my fellow panelists. Thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to brief on the topic today on gender-responsive approaches to counterterrorism. As you've heard, Women in International Security is an organization dedicated to promoting peace, security, and the inclusion of women. By noting that it actually delves deeply into inclusion of women, that doesn't mean we don't engage with working around issues related to masculinities. We actually do. One of the key things we actually coined is, for those we engage with, especially from the male gender, we call them wise men, because wise is pronounced, Women in International Security in short, is pronounced as wise. So when I was coming in to do the briefing, I asked myself, we have spent an entire week last week looking at statistics around violent extremism, not only in the Horn, but broadly in Africa. But yet, despite the grim numbers that we keep seeing from various reports, there's still hope within Africa. And so today I will focus mostly on what collective action can do, especially when looking at gender responses, gender-responsive approaches to counterterrorism. Imagine for a moment the faces of those who have endured the horrors of terrorism. Their lives shattered by violence, their dreams stolen, and their hopes dashed. Yet it is within this darkness that we find the strength to rise and reclaim what has been taken from us. And at the heart of this resilience, we find the flame of gender equality, burning brightly and guiding our paths towards a safer and more inclusive world. Gender equality, when placed at the center of our fight against terrorism and violent extremism, becomes a beacon of light that illuminates the way forward. It is a call to empower women and men as agents of change, not mere victims of circumstance. It is a call to challenge the gender stereotypes that confine us, restricting our potential to shape a better future. It is a call to address the vulnerabilities that make us susceptible to the lure of radicalization, forging a shield of resilience. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I would like to share the critical intersection of gender equality, prevention and countering of terrorism and violent extremism by giving the case of a collective action. It's not just in halls of power, such as this, or corridors of legislation, that change is taking place. As we've heard even from the different speakers, we have different iterations of the global strategy that is now including more and more on gender. It is within the communities and the streets and the hearts of those who refuse to be silenced that we also see massive change happening. I chair a remarkable network of women and men civil society organization peace builders spanning Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. They are dubbed Sisters Without Borders, but that doesn't take away from the fact we actually have men who are actually part of this network. So in essence, we do have brothers without borders. Together, we have created a platform of civil society actors from different backgrounds, cultures, and nations. And within us, we have those who are even survivors of terrorism. We've come together united by a common purpose to build bridges of understanding and resilience to preventing violent extremism. What we've ended up having as a collective action is massive results, which include even changing policies in some of the countries we serve, as well as influencing to ensure that they become a bit more gender inclusive. In Uganda, for instance, the network members have focused on community engagement and dialogue, challenging extremist ideologies, working with survivors of terrorism, and fostering social cohesion. By organizing awareness campaigns, promoting interfaith dialogue, and providing vocational training, Sisters Without Borders members empower women and girls, boys, and men to become agents of change. In Tanzania, we have worked tirelessly to address the unique challenges faced by communities through education initiatives, economic empowerment programs, including reviewing local bylaws, because I think sometimes there's an over-focus on national policies, but yet at the local level, you have bylaws that also need to be addressed to be made more gender inclusive. The members have been able to uplift marginalized individuals, fostering more resilience. In Kenya, where the network began, the initiative can be hailed as truly one that is bottom-up. It began with grassroots organizations engaging with communities, challenging extremist narratives, advocating for inclusive policies, and nurturing a culture of peace and knowledge sharing. The network has also worked to establish a partnership with government offices through sustained two-way engagement and collaboration on the introduction of gender-inclusive language in policy documents. With that drive to share knowledge and collectively address root causes of violent extremism, the network grew to include Uganda and Tanzania, with further expansion envisaged. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, as we journey ahead, we know it is not one without its challenges. It requires commitment of the Security Council, the Counter-Terrorism Committee, and member states to embrace gender mainstreaming as a core principle. It demands enhanced guidance and normative frameworks, empowering training programs and technical assistance, robust monitoring and reporting mechanisms, and partnerships that amplify the voices of civil society, built on trust, transparency, and mutual respect. Member states must foster an environment that encourages open dialogue, cooperation, and the exchange of knowledge and experiences. Together, we have the power to transform lives, to rewrite narratives, and to build a future where terrorism and violent extremism are mere remnants of the past. In the end, it is not just about policies and resolutions. It is about the faces we see, the lives we touch, the stories we create. It is about the hope we restore, the resilience we instill, and the unity we forge. PVE peace builders can strengthen and safeguard shared systems of participation, central to which is increasing gender equality inclusion. In this way, Sisters Without Borders work generates deep and genuine consultation between national governments and those on the periphery of society, with women and gender equality inclusivity at the core of their approach. The achievements of Sisters Without Borders in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania demonstrate the transformative power of gender mainstreaming in counterterrorism. Sisters Without Borders goes beyond words and discussion. They roll up their sleeves and work tirelessly on the ground, often in areas where the impact of terrorism is most deeply felt. Moving forward, the member states must roll up their sleeves and strengthen their commitment to gender mainstreaming in the global counterterrorism effort. We must enhance guidance and normative frameworks, not as a mere bureaucratic exercise, but as beacons of hope that illuminate a path towards a future where gender equality is the cornerstone of our collective security. We must provide the necessary tools, resources, and capacity-building programs that empower women, men, and communities at large to actively participate in countering of terrorism. Let us forge partnerships that bridge the divides between governments, civil society, and grassroots organizations. Partnerships that amplify the voices of women, that ensure their meaningful participation in decision-making processes, and that foster a sense of belonging and shared responsibility in the fight against extremism. But above all, let us remember that behind the policies, the resolutions, and the international frameworks, there are lives yearning for peace, justice, and equality. Lives that have been touched by the trauma of terrorism and violent extremism. Lives that need our unwavering commitment and our fierce determination. Together, let us recognize that advancing gender equality is not only a moral imperative, but a strategic necessity in countering terrorism and violent extremism. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank all four briefers for their excellent presentations, and I will now deliver a statement in my national capacity. Colleagues, I begin with a simple, yet too often contested statement. Effective counterterrorism responses are gender responsive and human rights compliant. Gender equality societies are more inclusive, just and cohesive, and therefore more resilient to violent extremism. We acknowledge Ms. Ali's work in making this vision a reality at the local level. Colleagues, we have all made important strides in mainstreaming a gender-responsive approach to counterterrorism. Today is an opportunity to acknowledge this, but we as member states, including through the Security Council, can do more. We urge an enhanced focus on gender in the implementation of the global counterterrorism strategy by bridging the gap between policy and practice to ensure a gender-responsive approach to preventing and countering terrorism. In addition, the Security Council needs to mandate member states to mainstream gender as a cross-cutting issue across all CT activities. And finally, the Counterterrorism Committee should pay greater attention to gendered experiences, including the disproportionate impact of sexual violence in terrorism contexts on women and girls. There continues to be near complete impunity for sexual violence perpetrated in terrorism contexts. It is therefore essential to address gaps in investigations and prosecutions in a human rights and gender-responsive manner. We welcome CETA's attention to this issue. But a truly comprehensive, gender-transformative criminal justice approach demands more. It demands that criminal justice processes are responsive to the experiences and needs of women and men as victims, witnesses, or perpetrators for all terrorist crimes, not just sexual violence. It means ensuring the full, equal, and meaningful participation and leadership of women in law enforcement and judicial institutions. And it means a holistic approach to and accountability for all terrorist crimes, including those with gendered dimension. But there are risks and challenges in this space which must be addressed. Capacity building assistance must not be tokenistic nor instrumentalize women. It must also avoid a narrow conception of gender, to consider how the ideology, strategy, and funding of terrorist groups are shaped by different understandings of structural gender inequality, as well as gender roles, identities, and stereotypes, including misogyny and militarized masculinities. Going forward, we must enhance support for local women-led civil society organizations, women human rights defenders, and UN Women, who we are delighted to have briefed us here today, as the normative lead to promote gender equality in the context of CT and PVE capacity building. We must ensure meaningful gender mainstreaming by UN entities and other capacity building providers, as exemplified by the IIJ today, by responding to the gendered impacts and forms of terrorism and counter-terrorism. Finally, we must centralize the human rights of all persons, including women and girls, in the law and the practice of counterterrorism. Malta looks forward to building on today's conversation. We will now move to the members of the UN Security Council for their interventions. I will first pass the floor to our first co-sponsor this afternoon, Mozambique. You have the floor.
Madam Chair, thank you very much for giving me the floor. Mozambique wishes to express our profound gratitude to Malta for the important initiative of organizing this Arria Formula meeting today. It has a special significance to us. The topic touched on one of Mozambique's priorities during its term as a non-permanent member of the Security Council. More importantly, it is relevant in our efforts to prevent and counter terrorism in our own country. For this reason, we have decided to associate ourselves with this noble and timely initiative. We thank the briefers, UN Women Counter-Terrorism Executive Directorate, the International Institute for Justice and the Rule of Law, and Women in International Security for their very important and insightful briefings. Madam Chair, terrorism is nowadays one of the most serious global threats to international peace and security. It is a scourge that is unacceptable in all its forms and manifestations. Indeed, it is a challenge that requires a global approach and international cooperation. In this context, we would like to welcome the 8th review of the Global Counterterrorism Strategy adopted last week. It constitutes a great opportunity to renew our international collective resolve to counter terrorism and violent extremism conducive to terrorism. We are conscious of the fact that we should carry out that fight in a gender-responsive manner. We know by experience that women and girls are disproportionately affected by terrorism. The continued use of sexual violence as a tactic of terrorism is a clear example. It is an abominable practice that we condemn in the strongest terms. But we must also acknowledge that women cannot be seen solely as victims in the context of terrorism. In Mozambique, and we believe in many parts of the world, women have been in the forefront in the fight against terrorism. Women have been playing an important role in preventing and countering terrorism and violent extremism conducive to terrorism. In Mozambique, we place in their hands the fundamental task of bringing about cohesion, unity, and understanding in families and communities. It is against this backdrop that member states and other actors in our societies are urged to utilize the necessary resources, platforms, policies, strategies, innovative initiatives at their disposal to ensure a gender-responsive approach to counter-terrorism. In this regard, the enhancement of international cooperation is a cornerstone pillar. Madam Chair, Mozambique has been affected by the scourge of terrorism and violent extremism since October 2017. Recognizing the important role of women in preventing and countering terrorism, the government of Mozambique has been empowering women in order to fulfill their tasks. In this connection, the government, in response to the evolving situation, has taken on board gender consideration geared at a three-pronged approach. One, military and defense dimension, with the remarkable participation of women in the front line itself. Two, social and development approach, with the women in the leadership position. And three, taking into account the humanitarian dimension. In the context of this approach, Mozambique has established a framework of development known as Mozambique's Integrated Development Agency for the North. This is a body with the main purpose of implementing development projects, focusing more on youth and women with close involvement of local communities. The overall objective of the government strategy is to contribute to a better future that can be translated overall by lowering poverty rate, a reduced inequality, and a reduction in violence, as well as improvement in human rights observance and increased opportunities for the people. The aim is also of promoting training and employment opportunities for women and young people, exploring the possibility of female entrepreneurship, training programs, forestalling the recruitment of terrorists operating in the region. Mozambique wishes to reaffirm our commitment to ensure greater involvement of women in all fronts to combat terrorism and violent extremism conducive to terrorism. We are committed to enhancing the capacities of the country to consolidate a gender-responsive approach to prevent and combat terrorism for the noble cause of bringing about to fruition peace, security, harmony as the main drivers for prosperity in the country, in the region, and in the world. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much, Mozambique. Our second co-sponsoring council members, United States, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The United States thanks UN Women, CTED, the IIJ, and Women in International Security Horn of Africa for your efforts to implement the Global Counterterrorism Strategy and UN Security Council resolutions that call for gender to be integrated as a cross-cutting issue in efforts to counter terrorism and violent extremism. As we all know, women and girls in all their diversity experience in security and conflict in unique ways and make equally unique contributions to addressing their drivers. Applying a gender lens is essential. Women and girls are often on the front lines mediating peace, delivering aid, and supporting communities, yet they are simultaneously confronted with heightened risks of violence, particularly gender-based violence, online and offline. Women and girls are consistently underrepresented in decision-making aimed at preventing conflict, building peace and security, and countering terrorism. Violent extremists are increasingly and deliberately engaging in online harassment, violence, and abuse, which can precede and carry over into physical settings and can follow women into their homes and communities to silence leaders and suppress democratic movements. By collaborating with women, civil society leaders, and other partners, including addressing the online environment, we seek to overcome this gap to empower women's full potential in shaping their communities' futures. Omitting women from terrorism prevention efforts forfeits their potential contributions as mitigators of violent extremism. Similarly, it is vital to understand how gender dynamics affect and are affected by counterterrorism efforts, particularly when violent extremist groups use gender-based violence as a tool for recruitment and a tactic to terrorize local communities. Incorporating women fully and at all levels of prevention and response, while also recognizing their complex and varied roles in society and in relation to violent extremism, leads to more effective and sustainable counterterrorism efforts. Safeguarding human rights enables women and girls full, equal, and meaningful participation across society and enhances the broader conditions for successful efforts to prevent terrorism and violent extremism. It is critical that we address the needs of women and girls affected by terrorism, advance gender-responsive approaches, and women's participation within security processes, and promote justice, human rights, and the rule of law. The United States will continue to work with civil society, the UN, and member states, including through efforts such as the Global Partnership for Action on Gender-Based Online Harassment and Abuse and the Christchurch Call to Action, to counter terrorism and violent extremism and prevent and address gender-based violence in a manner that respects human rights and integrates gender equality as a cross-cutting issue. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I now pass the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Madam President, Switzerland would like to thank Malta and the co-sponsors for bringing to the fore, through this area meeting, the importance of a gender-sensitive approach in our efforts to combat and prevent terrorism. I would also like to greet today's speakers who have shown us once again that strong partnerships and ongoing exchanges, particularly with members of civil society, are inherent to the success of our efforts. Switzerland has long been committed to the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, both in a specific geographical contexts and in all its thematic work, including counterterrorism. We would like to make 2 points in this regard. Firstly, a gender-sensitive approach recognizes that people are differently affected by violent extremism and terrorism, and by measures to counter them. This allows us to understand the push and pull factors linked to specific concepts of masculinity and femininity that are exploited by violent extremists to recruit women and men and incite them to violence. Switzerland is concerned by the way violent extremist and terrorist groups have long and successfully used a gendered approach to recruitment. To counter their efforts, we must do more to strengthen the awareness and capacity of all those involved, particularly security and justice institutions. Switzerland remains committed to strengthening collaboration with civil society actors in all their diversity and to ensure that their recommendations are at the heart of our efforts while protecting them from reprisals and instrumentalization. It is important that civil society, and women in particular, are an integral part of the development of policies and programs to prevent violence and to build peace. Whether at the local, national, or international level, it's time that they are recognized and mobilized for the transformative role and values of their contributions. Crucial work is already being done by CTED and UN Women in this area, and we will continue to support their efforts. Secondly, Switzerland attaches great importance to accountability and the prevention of impunity, particularly in contexts where sexual and gender-based violence is used as a weapon and a tactic of terrorism. This obligation is crucial to ensure justice for victims, to promote reconciliation, and to prevent further violence. We remain true to our long-standing commitment, including supporting CTED in developing proposals for member states in this area. Madam President, I would like to conclude by emphasizing that gender mainstreaming is a prerequisite for the sustainable prevention of violent extremism and terrorism. To succeed, we must all work together collectively. As the Secretary General said in his opening address to the Counter-Terrorism Week, we must ensure that counterterrorism strategies and measures are inclusive of all communities, groups, and voices, especially minorities, women, and young people, and do not prevent civil society from carrying out its essential work. His words will continue to guide our commitment on this subject within the Council and beyond. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland and pass the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you for giving me the floor, Madam Chair. We'd like to congratulate Malta and the other co-sponsors for convening this Arria formula. The organisation of this meeting is a complement to the topics discussed during Counter-Terrorism Week. We're also grateful to the briefers for their introductory words. Ecuador supports the crucial mainstreaming and integration of the gender perspective in the development of counter-terrorism and preventing violent extremism policies, particularly to counter narratives and recruitment tactics that have a direct effect on women and girls. Chair, the adoption of Resolution 2242 in 2015 recognised for the first time the differentiated impact that terrorism has on the human rights of women and girls. At the same time, it called for the integration of the rights of women and children in member states' agendas and also the UN's agendas on women, peace and security, on counterterrorism and preventing violent extremism. We note that 8 years after its adoption, there has been some progress made in that direction, thanks to high-level fora and initiatives that have fostered to incorporating gender equality in counterterrorism plans of various member states. Women are making a critical contribution to combating terrorism and violent extremism. They build more resilient communities and promote prevention efforts. Their full involvement in all aspects of counterterrorism, from policy design to the judiciary, law enforcement, intelligence services and security sector, is fundamental. Therefore, the trend identified in the Secretary-General's report on women, peace and security in 2022 on the use of infrastructure and counter-terrorist legislation against women's civil society organisations and human rights defenders is a source of concern. In this regard, we should recall Resolution 1325. This resolution reaffirms the role of women in conflict prevention and resolution. It urges for the mainstreaming of the gender perspective in all efforts for peace and security. We must step up our efforts to ensure that prevention of violent extremism and counterterrorism policies address gender dynamics, diverse roles, and the intersectional nature of women's rights. And we believe that we could consider the following strategies in that regard. Firstly, we should expand the impact assessments into gender in designing counter-terrorism policies, replicating what has been done in the framework document that CTED uses for its country assessments. We should also be deepening research into radicalization and recruitment of women and men by terrorist groups. Secondly, we should be strengthening links with women's civil society organizations. Thirdly, CTED and the Counter-Terrorism Office should continue working closely with UN Women as a key partner in promoting the mainstreaming of a gender perspective. Fourth, we should promote technical cooperation by specialist organizations to support member states to integrate a gender perspective into their legislation, the counter-terrorism legislation and policies. 5, we should be strengthening national criminal justice systems to punish crimes committed by terrorist groups against women and girls, including sexual and gender-based violence-related crimes. Chair, to conclude, we would like to reaffirm our firmly held belief that the mainstreaming of the gender perspective contributes to generating a comprehensive approach to counter-terrorism and preventing violent extremism. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador and pass the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Je vous remercie.
I thank you, Madam President, for having given me the floor. I also thank you for this joint initiative in an Arria formula meeting focusing on the gender aspects of combating terrorism and violent extremism so as to better include it in national strategies addressing these scourges. And I also thank the briefers for their extremely useful and substantive contributions. Madam President, one of the fundamental questions raised here is that of the exclusion and marginalization from society of entire communities. These communities become vulnerable and thus are easy targets for recruitment and radicalization by criminal organizations and terrorist groups. Resolution 2242 of the Security Council rightly recognizes the impact of terrorism and violent extremism that would lead to terrorism on the fundamental rights of women and girls, particularly on their health, education, and their participation in public life. It also notes the importance of implementing programs for women in peace and security. Moreover, the Resolution A/74/90 from the 8th of April 2020 recognizes that terrorist groups disproportionately target women and girls engaging in gender-based violent acts. Madam President, the vulnerability of women and youth require that we acknowledge the gender dimension to a greater extent in our prevention strategies, and this should have the full attention of the Security Council and member states to eradicate the scourge of terrorism. This imperative stresses the relevance of Resolution 1325, which urges the recognition of women as agents for the prevention and settlement of conflicts and in peace building by promoting their full participation in taking decisions to prevent and settle disputes. Here, I wish to recall the need for states to effectively implement the provisions of these resolutions, including by reactivating national action plans, as well as follow-up and evaluation plans for program countries, including scorecards and performance indicators, as well as the development of data collection tools for activities on the ground under current programs. Moreover, we must also ensure that support is provided for states' capacity building, allowing for better cooperation, allowing for women to have greater access to basic social services, particularly education and digital technology. Indeed, not addressing these issues could lead to incomplete responses and strategies that are ineffective, particularly due to a lack of technical means and precise data that would aid in a more appropriate response being developed. Here I wish to stress the need of better adapted international cooperation to fill the gaps that a large number of countries are facing and to bolster their ability to manage all the dimensions of the prevention and the fight against terrorism and violent extremism for terrorist purposes. This requires the involvement of all actors in the national level, including civil society organizations, and the establishment of appropriate programs to oversee gender mainstreaming, including through the use of new information technologies for a methodological and effective response. In conclusion, Madam President, I wish to stress the need to promote greater responsibility by states in gender mainstreaming in the fight against terrorism. Let me find my next page. I apologize. And I will restart my conclusion. To conclude, Madam President, I wish to stress the need to promote greater responsibility from states in acknowledging gender mainstreaming in the fight against terrorism and violent extremism. To do so, we must establish provisions to apply the principle of responsibility to guarantee continued acknowledgement of gender issues in an institutionalized framework. I thank you for your attention.
The floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Madame l'Ambassadrice.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. I, in turn, would like to thank the briefers for their presentations. I congratulate the Maltese mission for organising this debate on a very exciting topic, and this is actually the aim of Arria Formula meetings, to make us reflect on this sort of topic. I'd like to touch on 2 points. Firstly, it's clear that terrorism thrives on gender inequality and that terrorist groups use sexual and gender-based violence to terrorise civilians. Now, it's clear that the exclusion of women and gender inequalities are one of the drivers feeding the development of violent extremism and terrorism. Looking at Afghanistan, for instance, the exclusion of Afghan women, that's about half the population, is an attack on their rights and freedoms. It also stymies the country's economic recovery and long-term stability, but it also creates fertile ground for radicalisation and terrorism. This is the same across the whole world, particularly in war zones. Terrorists exploit divisions and inequalities in order to establish their domination. It's also clear that sexual violence is widely used as a weapon of war in order to terrorise populations and destroy communities. I'm thinking hints, for instance, about the atrocities committed by Daesh against Yazidi women that are well known and documented. There are also cases in Africa of the abductions of women and young girls. These are actually widespread terrorist methods in those areas. However, we also need to combat stereotypes. Women aren't just victims, but can also be the perpetrators. So a second point I wanted to turn to now is how we can respond to these phenomena. Obviously, our response has to be multidimensional. We need to strengthen prevention and also countering radicalisation. To do that, it's important that we have measures that are gender sensitive but also respectful of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Secondly, we also need to better support the victims of sexual violence. In this regard, France is committed to supporting and providing guidance to female victims and survivors. In fact, we contribute around 6.2 million euros to the Global Survivor Fund. In combating sexual and gender-based violence, we also need to counter impunity. Violence and hatred towards women and towards other groups of individuals is also perpetrated online. This is also an issue that we should be addressing. That's why France, New Zealand and their partners have integrated this issue into the work of the Christchurch Corps. Several colleagues have already talked about Resolution 2242 of 2015. This should continue to guide us in mainstreaming gender in counter-terrorism policies. France will continue to work in this vein and to implement this resolution. We have ambitious feminist diplomacy, and we aim to ensure this is realised in all areas, including security. That's why we have a policy on equality and diversity. Finally, women-led organisations and women human rights defenders are all essential partners who contribute to ensuring the effectiveness of our counter-terrorism efforts. We also welcome the fact that the 8th review of the Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy took into account the role of women-led organisations. Thank you.
Thank you. I pass the floor now to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, I would like to thank Malta and the co-sponsors for organizing this important Arria Formula meeting. Also, I thank the distinguished briefers for their informative contributions. Preventing and countering terrorism and violent extremism require a human rights-based approach. Gender equality is central to this. The full, equal, and meaningful participation of women is essential from designing to implementation in counter-terrorism policies. Japan reaffirms its commitment to the principles enshrined in Security Council Resolution 2242. This resolution calls for the greater integration of gender considerations in countering terrorism and violent extremism. The Security Council, through its Counter-Terrorism Committee, should reinforce gender mainstreaming in member states' measures by identifying challenges and facilitating capacity building. Further, the Council has to facilitate discussions on accountability for sexual and gender-based violence. Japan appreciates the work of the Committee's Executive Directorate in this regard. Member states may face challenges in incorporating a gender-responsive approach. Capacity building supports, such as training, education, and technical assistance, will help member states to overcome these challenges. International organizations, such as UN Women or regional bodies, play a pivotal role. To this end, Japan, in collaboration with the UN Women, conducted projects on preventing violent extremism entitled Empowered Women Peace Communities, with a focus in Indonesia, Bangladesh, the Philippines, and Thailand. These projects led to the adoption of national action plans on women, peace, and security in this region. This April, Japan adopted its third national action plan. Our plan stresses the importance of women's participation, gender mainstreaming, and gender-responsive approaches in countering terrorism and violent extremism. We believe this serves as a blueprint for member states, and we are happy to share our experience. UN entities and other international and regional organizations play an important role to ensure greater attention to gender considerations. The UN Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy plays a central role in such efforts. It enhances the integration of the rule of law, human rights, and gender as cross-cutting elements to coordinate across UN entities and relevant organizations, as well as member states. We welcome the adoption of the 8th review of GCTS last week by consensus. In conclusion, Japan reiterates its commitment to gender equality and women's meaningful participation in all counter-terrorism efforts and urges all member states to support these endeavors. Together, we can ensure a more effective, gender-responsive, and human rights-based approach to counter terrorism and violent extremism. I thank you.
Thank you. I now pass the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I thank the organizers and particularly the Mission of Malta for convening this Arria Formula meeting on this timely subject. I also thank the briefers for their insightful remarks. Terrorism is indiscriminate by nature. Its destructive power may affect us all, regardless of our gender. Nevertheless, gender-sensitive approaches respond to very practical concerns. They're necessary to ensure the effectiveness of counter-terrorism action. The Council has already demonstrated in several resolutions its awareness that gender plays a significant role both on how terrorism works and how we should fight it. Counter-terrorism measures that are solely security-focused and fail to encompass human rights and gender perspectives can increase marginalization and exclusion. There are many examples we can bring up to corroborate this understanding regarding women as terrorists or as victims of terrorism alike. Terrorist groups resort to different techniques and narratives to recruit women and men to the ranks. Women are lured on the internet and can be specifically targeted to either become spouses or combatants. There are data showing that terrorist attacks perpetrated by women may be more lethal. The lack of female security on searches and frisking may help them to get closer to their targets. Women are subject to heightened risks and different forms of violence and abuse committed by terrorist groups, including killing, trafficking, abduction, and rape. Sexual and gender-based violence can be also part of the strategic objectives and ideology of certain terrorist groups, and used as an instrument to increase their power through supporting, financing, and recruitment. Moreover, the Counter-Terrorism Committee Executive Directorate has already called the attention of the Council members to specific prosecutorial challenges member states can face with regards to women associated with foreign terrorist fighters. They can be either perpetrators, supporters, or facilitators of terrorist acts themselves, or victims of situations out of their control. Gender approaches are not limited to policies focused on women issues. Quite the contrary. Considering masculinities is an essential part of the gender mainstreaming. Gender stereotypes and negative social norms may lie in the origins of the radicalization of young men. Dispossessed, unemployed, discriminated against, they may swell the ranks of terrorist groups attracted by income perspectives and promises of a sense of purpose. It is of utmost importance to acknowledge the need for a gender-aware and sensitive implementation of the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy revised last week to ensure tangible results. Brazil believes that not only CTAD, as mandated by the Council, but also member states should acknowledge the horizontal character of gender considerations in shaping their policies and legal frameworks in counterterrorism. In this process, they should ensure full participation of women in data collection on gender aspects of their implementation. This is a very concrete need, which, unaddressed, may impair the ability to effectively counter this threat to international peace and security. Thank you.
Thank you. I now pass the floor to Representative of Albania.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me begin by thanking the delegation of Malta for convening this important meeting and the briefers for their valuable insights. Madam Chair, we share the deep concern at the condition of women caused by terrorism and stress the need to recalibrate the fight against it to alleviate suffering and empower women. Countering terrorism is a complex and multifaceted challenge that requires a coordinated approach. Preventive ways must be put in action immediately. Terrorists use various forms of sexual violence against women and girls as a means to exploit, recruit, and control not only individuals, but communities as well. We are deeply concerned at the findings of the monitoring team of 1267 Committee regarding the recruitment and sexual abuses of women and girls for terrorist purposes. Such crimes, including human trafficking, are phenomena that disproportionately impact women and girls. They, the women and girls, constitute over 70% of the overall number of identified victims. This is not tolerable, nor acceptable, and must be stopped. We must pay special attention to women's needs and safety, and do our best to integrate them fully and meaningfully in any peace and security agenda. Madam Chair, let me highlight 4 key steps that, in our view, can enhance states' capacities to ensure a gender-responsive approach to counterterrorism. First, states should develop gender-sensitive policies and strategies that address the specific needs of women and girls who have suffered from or have been affected by terrorism, including access to justice and support services. Second, we should engage women in decision-making processes related to counterterrorism. Their participation can help ensure that counterterrorism policies and strategies consider the specific needs and perspectives of women. Third, we must redouble our efforts in delivering justice and ensuring accountability, with a particular focus on the impact on women and girls. Last but not least, we must ensure that women and children impacted by terrorism have access to effective remedies and reparations that fulfill their needs. We welcome the cooperation of UN bodies with civil society organizations that promote and support their reintegration. In conclusion, Madam President, we need to invest in real capacity building in people and institutions to ensure gender-sensitive counterterrorism strategies that are fully in line with international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Albania will not rest until women enjoy equal and full rights that protect their interests and enable them to flourish in conflict zones and everywhere. I thank you.
Thank you. I pass the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to thank the delegation of Malta for organizing this important meeting on enhancing the capacities of member states to ensure a gender-responsive approach to counter-terrorism. I would also like to join the other delegations in thanking briefers for their perspectives on the subject. As a member state, Ghana recognizes the significance of developing capacity to ensure gender-responsive, human rights compliant in preventing and countering terrorism. We acknowledge the difficulties in integrating gender into counter-terrorism strategies and the need for capacity building to address these challenges. Against this backdrop, my delegation would like to highlight on 3 points. First, effective counter-terrorism strategies require a deep understanding of different needs and experiences of those affected by terrorism, particularly women, youth, and marginalized groups. Capacity building initiative can help law enforcement agencies, policymakers, and other stakeholders in designing and implementing gender-sensitive and human rights-based strategies for preventing and responding to acts of terrorism. Such approaches can help to ensure that terrorism efforts do not infringe on the rights of individuals or promote discrimination or violence on the basis of gender. Second, it is essential to guarantee the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women and young people in developing strategies to counter terrorism. Women and youth are significantly affected by terrorism and violent extremism. Their unique experiences and points of view can provide vital insights into the root causes of terrorism as well as practical solutions for its prevention. With their participation in the development of anti-terrorism measures, we can tap into their potentials as agents of change and equip them to play a decisive role in creating more resilient societies. Third, empowering women and youth in development of counter-terrorism strategies are crucial in preventing their radicalization and empowering them to play an active role in preventing and combating violent extremism in their communities. In addition, it fosters inclusivity by ensuring that all views are heard and considered. This consequently leads to efficient policies that are sensitive to the needs of all segments of society. As a country, Ghana has taken steps to address gender inequalities that may create conditions conducive to terrorism, including promoting women's participation in peace building and security efforts. For example, Ghana has increased the number of women in its security forces and has established a technical working committee to implement National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security and to mainstream gender perspective in our counter-terrorism strategies. As a country committed to upholding human rights, fundamental freedoms, and the rule of law in our counter-terrorism approaches, Ghana has implemented measures to ensure that its counter-terrorism efforts respect human rights. Ghana recognizes the importance of protecting fundamental freedoms, including freedoms of expression, association, and assembly. The country has also put in place measures to ensure that its counter-terrorism laws and policies do not unduly restrict these freedoms. In its efforts to counter and prevent terrorism, Ghana is committed to upholding the rule of law. The country has established a legal framework that provides for investigation and prosecution of terrorist crimes, whilst ensuring that suspects are afforded due process and fair trial to ensure that justice is served in terrorism cases. In conclusion, Ghana believes in ensuring the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women and youth in developing policies to ensure that counter-terrorism, as well as more effective, sustainable terrorism strategies that reflect the need and aspiration of all societies. Ghana recognizes that upholding human rights, fundamental freedoms, and the rule of law is essential in this endeavor. I thank you.
Thank you, and I pass the floor to the representative of China.
Madam Chair, China thanks the briefers for their presentations. The gender issue in the context of terrorism and counterterrorism warrants our close attention. China condemns any and all terrorist attacks against women or terrorist activities conducted by exploiting women. I wish to highlight 4 points. First, the collective international effort to combat and prevent terrorism enables us to address counter-terrorism-related issues, including the gender perspective, by tackling the root causes of the scourge. As long as terrorism exists, attacks on women may persist as one of the means by which terrorist groups create terror and violate human rights. As long as terrorism exists, terrorist groups will continue to recruit combatants or support personnel, including women, into their ranks. It is imperative to take a two-pronged approach to both combat and prevent terrorism in order to root out the underlying drivers of terrorism through inter alia, eradicating poverty, promoting education, and creating more jobs. This is the only way to remove root and branch the threat of terrorism to women and keep women safe from terrorist attacks and violence. Second, women may be victims of terrorism. They may orchestrate, perpetrate, or support terrorist attacks. They may also be counter-terrorism practitioners. In view of this, women should be given the right and proper role to play in counter-terrorism. We should enhance women's capacity, access, and voice in decision-making with their will fully respected and take gender differences into full account in all stages of the process, from prevention, law enforcement, to victim support, in order to make such work more effective. Third, the gender dimension of counterterrorism is not an isolated issue and needs to be placed within the overall context of women's empowerment and development. States should invest efforts in eliminating gender discrimination and differential treatment and promoting women's empowerment and socio-economic development in tandem. States have the primary responsibility for preventing and combating terrorism and protecting women, and the international community should encourage and support states in tailoring the actions they take to their national realities. Relevant UN agencies should work within the purview of the respective mandates and expertise. Fourth, the purpose of introducing the gender perspective into international counterterrorism cooperation is to help countries better prevent and combat terrorism, rather than to use it as a pretext for putting pressure on other countries or even interfering in their internal affairs. Different countries have different national circumstances, and the gender dimension of counterterrorism differs from country to country, as do the gender-responsive counterterrorism measures. The ultimate goal of international counterterrorism cooperation, including the capacity-building support from the UN to the recipient countries, is to help countries improve their counterterrorism measures in the light of their unique national circumstances, rather than to interfere with these countries' counterterrorism efforts by exploiting the gender issue. China is an advocate of gender equality. We are the doers for women's empowerment. The active contributions of China and Chinese women are consistently and highly visible in the work of the UN in such areas as peacekeeping and sustainable development. We shall continue to work with all parties to support women's political and economic empowerment, bring into play women's role in the maintenance of international peace, including counterterrorism, and galvanize the global cause of gender equality and women's development. Thank you.
Thank you, and I pass the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and my thanks to you and the co-sponsors of
this event, for organising it on such an important topic and so quickly after UNCT Week. Thank you also to the briefers for your important remarks and insights, which have really brought out the gender dimensions of terrorism, which require comprehensive and inclusive solutions. Like many of us in this meeting, the United Kingdom is supported to mainstreaming gender in our approach to counter-terrorism, including by challenging harmful norms and by building inclusive policy frameworks. And I'd like to highlight 3 areas of particular focus for the United Kingdom. First, on delivering justice for the victims and survivors of terrorist use of sexual and gender-based violence. One need only look at the atrocities endured by the Yazidi community in Iraq, as was evoked by one of our briefers today, to see the gendered impact of terrorism. So the Security Council's support to Iraq in efforts to hold Daesh perpetrators to account, including through the UN investigative team to promote accountability for crimes committed by Daesh, remains critical. Second, this council should look to use the tools at its disposal to hold perpetrators to account. The Security Council has used sanctions for conflict-related sexual violence in the past in a range of settings where it's had real impact. And in Security Council Resolution 2610, the Council affirmed its intention to do so for individuals and entities associated with Daesh or Al-Qaeda, and we'd like to see that happen. Third, as has been evoked, capacity building initiatives can play a critical role in strengthening criminal justice institutions, and these initiatives, along with enhanced research and data collection, help to address gaps in the investigation and prosecution of sexual and gender-based violence in terrorist contexts. And we're grateful to CTED and to related Global Compact entities for their work in this regard. For our part, the United Kingdom launched our 5th National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security in February of this year, and our new National Action Plan focuses on inclusive and effective approaches to tackling conflict, because we know that women's active participation and contributions make societies more prosperous and more secure. And our plan outlines commitments to tackle violence against women and girls comprehensively, including in our CT efforts. Ambassador, our fight against terrorism must be robust and sustained, and it is bolstered by our collective commitment to gender equality. By embracing gender-responsive approaches, we pave the way for a safer and more just world. Thank you.
Thank you. And I pass the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Russian Federation is in favor of increasing the effectiveness of international cooperation in countering terrorism. Success in this area depends to a large extent on the appropriate steps being taken by countries to combat this global evil. In our view, the determining factors here are the suppression of ideological, material, financial and personal support to militants, to strengthen the national capacities of law enforcement agencies of UN member states and their legal framework for that purpose, as well as interstate cooperation and information exchanges with regards to possible terrorist threats. The topics for discussion today is multifaceted. On one hand, terrorism has no gender. Monstrous acts that take innocent lives are committed by both men and women. On the other hand, there are a number of features to involving women in terrorist activities. They are skillfully exploited by international terrorist organizations, including ISIL. Those who are fighting the terrorist scourge should also not ignore them. Today, we would like to focus on the issue of female family members of foreign terrorist fighters. According to our specialized agencies, spending every day under the influence of terrorist organizations surrounded by fanatical terrorists radicalizes a person's thinking, even if they didn't want to be directly involved in violence. An essential element needed to participate in a terrorist organization is the oath of allegiance. Not only fighters go through this process, but so do their wives. As experience has shown, after the defeat of terrorist organizations, women from this category often become the most radicalized and steeped in extremist ideology members of the terrorist underground. We are actively working to prevent this. It's also important to understand the nature and the methods used by terrorist organizations to influence women. It is in defining the differences in the terrorists' approaches and developing the most effective methods to counter them that we see a role for specialized UN bodies on gender issues. Terrorist organizations use various tactics to recruit women to their ranks. Often, they focus on poverty, a lack of education, or the social exclusion of women. Specific but fraudulent life goals are presented to them, as well as a sense of belonging and financial incentives. Terrorist organizations differentiate and tailor their propaganda and ideology to women's perceptions and psychology. They often portray themselves as defenders of the oppressed or champions of justice. Social networks have become a powerful tool for organizations to recruit women. Even participation in social networking groups creates a feeling of community and belonging. The recruiting also uses personal, including romantic relationships and family ties. Terrorists target women who have family members or friends already involved in these illegal activities. It's important to note that not all women who join terrorist organizations are coerced or subjected to aggressive brainwashing. Some join because they believe in the organization's ideology. However, it is important to recognize that many women who join terrorist organizations become victims of exploitation and manipulation. Efforts must be made to prevent their recruitment and to support them. In this regard, a practical gender dimension can be seen in the social rehabilitation and reintegration of FTF family members. Given the devastating consequences of the psychological treatment of women from terrorist surroundings, our experts estimate that their return to a normal, peaceful life in society is a very difficult process. The principal position of the Russian Federation is that it is necessary not only to carry out preventative measures, but also to ensure that the principle of inevitable punishment for carrying out terrorist activities and for supporting terrorism in any way is observed by bringing each and every one involved in terrorism, regardless of their gender, to justice. In this context, we are convinced that shifting the focus of UN counterterrorism entities with a mandate to coordinate state counterterrorism activities to gender and human rights issues is short-sighted and leads to the paralysis of agencies with unique security competencies. This approach only plays into the hands of terrorists. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, and I'll pass the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
في البداية
At the outset, I would like to thank the organizers for holding this important meeting. I'd also like to thank the briefers. We welcome holding this meeting that focuses on building the capacities of member states in the field of combating terrorism, taking into account the perspective of women. Last week, the Security Council has unanimously adopted the first resolution ever on tolerance, peace, and international security. It was co-sponsored by the UK and the UAE. The resolution number 2686 is the first resolution of its kind to recognize hate speech, racism, extremism, and gender discrimination, as well as others are the reason for conflicts, occurrence, aggravation, and recurrence. Sexual violence can protract conflicts. The resolution recognizes that the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women and gender equality will contribute to fight extremism and support tolerance in societies. The resolution also focuses on helping victims in armed conflicts. Thus, we will focus in today's statement on 3 points that have to do with the protection of victims and terrorism survivors and increasing the participation of women in criminal justice and security institutions. First, the international community has to use a proactive approach that is based on developing better factors to prevent extremism. We call for including early warning mechanisms through a women-sensitive approach. That's why my country has hosted Hidayah Center. It is an independent multilateral think tank that was built as a response to this need, and it was mentioned in the Global Counter-Terrorism Forum. The UAE is one of its founders. This includes the need to fight extremism. Hidayah Center provides evidence-based programs that include empowering women to play a more effective role in fighting extremism in their local communities. Second, member states have a responsibility of protecting the rights of victims and survivors. This requires putting at the center the survivors and their efforts to build the capacities of countries, including the field of criminal justice. It is important to provide health care and reintegration of victims in societies. They must be provided with psychological and social support. Finally, it is important to shed light on the positive impact of enhancing women participation in criminal justice institutions and security institutions. The full representation of women, especially on high levels, will help make more balanced decisions and policies. In the end, the UAE confirms its commitment to continue the integration between women, peace, security on one hand and counter-terrorism on the other. This is shown by my country taking the lead of the counter-terrorism committee. We have also participated in the informal expert team on women, peace and security with Switzerland. Thank you.
Thank you. It is now my honor to turn the floor to our co-sponsors. As well as Mozambique and the United States, I want to thank you for all your support in organizing this meeting today. I'll now give the floor to the representative of Costa Rica.
Madam Chair, Costa Rica congratulates Malta for organising this event, of which we are also one of the co-sponsors. I'd like to begin by stressing that the fight against terrorism, both in its practices and its consequences, is often considered to be gender neutral. This view is erroneous. Counter-terrorism, its legislation and policy, both at the formal level as well as institutions and their implementation, are based on gender stereotypes and have serious gender consequences. In this regard, let me highlight 3 areas in which we can work to address this gender blindness. First, the prevention of violent extremism and counter-terrorism measures have significant implications for women and girls. Laws related to counter-terrorism funding have been found to negatively impact women's rights organizations. Even though women themselves are not on the sanctions lists, they are often the ones who suffer the greatest impact when their family members or spouses are on it. This is due to limited access to work, funds, bank accounts, and independent sources of income, which are often linked to patriarchal family structures or legal systems. Because of this, Costa Rica regrets that the 8th revision of the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Strategy did not incorporate these dimensions and the connection between masculinities, structural inequality, and the generation of violent movements. For Costa Rica, it's imperative that we rectify this omission and that we ensure that future revisions of the strategy prioritize and include the gender approach. Second, the prevention of violent extremism and counterterrorism measures has important implications for men and adolescent boys. When men and adolescent boys are captured, they are transferred to prisons, while women and young children are interned in closed camps. This means that sometimes young boys are treated as extremists who must be punished rather than protected. They are treated as a threat rather than as victims from an early age. For Costa Rica, separating and detaining adolescent boys from their mothers is a deplorable practice that violates their rights and dignity. The indefinite detention of boys based on the alleged crimes of their family members is a form of gender discrimination with serious and long-lasting consequences. Third, Costa Rica wishes to emphasize the need to include local organizations and communities in the fight against terrorism and violent extremism. Civil society actors, including women's rights groups, youth-led organizations, and community leaders, are a crucial link in the strategy. Costa Rica encourages member states to create platforms for meaningful engagement with civil society, ensuring their participation in policy development, implementation, and evaluation processes. In harnessing the knowledge of local actors, we can foster greater ownership and effectiveness in our counter-terrorism efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. I now pass the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Muchas gracias, señora Presidenta.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. My delegation would like to express its thanks to Malta for organising this meeting. I'd also like to thank the panellists for their briefings. On the 28th of July 2021, in its capacity as an elected member of the Security Council and as a part of our feminist foreign policy, Mexico organised a meeting in this same format on the topic preventing terrorism and violent extremism through tackling gender stereotypes, masculinities, and structural gender inequality. It was the first time that the Security Council was able to address the notions of masculinities in the context of preventing terrorism and violent extremism conducive to terrorism. On the basis of these discussions, together with previous side events with the participation of CETED, the topic was incorporated by the Secretary-General in his reports on terrorism, both to the Security Council and to the General Assembly. In the last and most recent report, A77/718, it is pointed out the following, and I quote, "It's imperative that measures to prevent and counter terrorism and violent extremism fully integrate a specific and contextualized gender analysis that, among other things, looks at the roles of men, masculinities, and structural gender inequalities and stereotypes in radicalization, mobilization, and recruitment." End quote. Notwithstanding the clarity of the Secretary-General in his report, once again, it wasn't possible to include a single reference to this issue in the resolution of the 8th review of the Global Review adopted last week, as has just been mentioned by Costa Rica. Gender shouldn't be understood as a phenomenon for women. The fact that in large part it is men and young men who decide to join extremist organizations and who carry out terrorist attacks, we believe that we should place the notions of masculinity and gender stereotypes that are present in all societies of the world at the heart of our discussions with an intersectional perspective. It's very important to clarify that this approach in no way suggests that all notions of masculinity are inherently negative. On the contrary, it seeks to enable us to build new masculinities that contribute positive values conducive to gender equality and to more just societies. Being a man is not a problem nor an anti-value. But for as long as we don't undertake this exercise of reflection and analysis, toxic patriarchal patterns that create the conditions for radicalization, recruitment, and violence will continue to be repeated. For these reasons, we are pleased to see that with initiatives such as this, that we are proud to co-sponsor, the issue is continuing to advance and develop in the Security Council. We're confident that gradually we'll be able to craft common strategies on the understanding that this is an issue that doesn't seek to be confrontational, but rather that seeks to modernize and update our way of understanding these complex phenomena. As was said by the delegation of the United States at the Arria Formula 2 years ago, this is an issue that has been a blind spot that we can't afford to overlook. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I now pass the floor to the representative of Spain.
Muchas gracias, señora.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you also very much to the panellists for their briefings. It really is an honour for Spain to be able to co-sponsor this Arria formula, which is of great importance, because one of the fundamental issues for us is, on the one hand, the fight against terrorism, a topic that we have great experience in Spain, and secondly, the gender dimension, which is a part of our feminist foreign policy. In this context, I'd like to underscore a few national level initiatives, and then I'll turn to Spain's role at the United Nations. I'll then close with a few lessons learned and experiences as a consequence of our long-standing history in this area. Nationally speaking, we've adopted our second national plan of action for women, peace and security. We also have a feminist foreign policy, the main strand of which is women, peace and security. We've also mainstreamed gender in our national security strategy, our national counter-terrorism strategy, and our humanitarian diplomacy strategy for 2023 to 2026. Within the UN, we co-facilitated the 7th review of the global counter-terrorism strategy, and we continue to work to include the topics of human rights and the rule of law to ensure that we mainstream gender in the review and also reflect the important role played by women in the prevention and combating of terrorism. Subsequently, in 2022, in Spain, in Malaga, we convened a high-level meeting on the role of civil society, human rights, and counter-terrorism. That same year, in our capacity as co-chairs of the group of Friends of the Victims of Terrorism, we were very actively involved in the first Global Congress of Victims that was held at these headquarters, and the second edition of the Global Congress will be held next year in Spain. Furthermore, I'd like to also refer to the side event that we organised with Iraq at the last session of the Human Rights Council to address the human rights of women and children as victims and survivors of terrorism. One of the issues that was talked about at that event was the importance of placing human rights at the heart of our counter-terrorism efforts as a way of combating the threat of terrorism. To conclude, I'd like to share a few lessons learned and experiences that we've accumulated over the years. Firstly, the importance of memory and how important it is to listen to the testimonies of victims of terrorism. In Spain, we have a centre called the Memorial Centre for the Victims of Terrorism. It's a global beacon in this area. We also have an educational project called Memory and Terrorism Prevention, in which secondary school students combine learning modules, and they are able to talk directly to the victims of terrorism. And this has shown us that we've seen that this has a very important impact on their lives and their understanding of the issue. Secondly, the importance of victims associations, which are often led by women. The activism of these associations has been decisive in recognising victims' rights. We're working to set up a global network of associations of terrorist victims, and we are within the UN promoting the establishment of a trust fund for the victims of terrorism. We hope that both initiatives will be in place by next year. Finally, I'd like to underscore the importance of rehabilitation and reintegration programs, specifically for women. According to a recent study sponsored by the European Commission, women face stigmatization and economic discrimination, and it's very important that women have specific programs to enable them to address the obstacles that they face. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I now pass the floor to the representative of New Zealand, who will make a statement in national capacity, but also one on behalf of CANS. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Malta for your leadership. Thank you to the briefers for your excellent briefings today. New Zealand is very proud to be a co-sponsor of this important gathering. For Aotearoa New Zealand, all conversations about preventing and countering terrorism and violent extremism take place in the shadow of the Christchurch terrorist attack of 15th of March 2019, when a terrorist killed 51 Muslim New Zealanders. We have learned from that experience that New Zealand needs to take a whole of government and a whole of society approach to countering and preventing terrorism and violent extremism. A gender-responsive, human rights-based approach is fundamental. New Zealand's countering terrorism and violent extremism strategy guides our work. It is ideologically neutral to respond to a range of existing and emerging threats. Our recent focus has been on prevention, including the development of a preventing and countering violent extremism strategic framework. Our Human Rights Commission plays an important role in ensuring our approach puts human rights at its core. Through extensive yet thoughtful public engagement, we've been able to reflect the voices of those who are often hesitant to speak to government. As part of the government's consultation process on the strategic framework, participants shared examples of recent backlash to gender equality in New Zealand, including where women's rights were perceived as being secured at the expense of men's and where transgender rights have been challenged. We heard that toxic masculinity is inherent in many extremist groups. These groups are often linked to white supremacy and have strong ideologies regarding the physical attributes men and women should possess, as well as the social and cultural roles each gender should inhabit. Mainstreaming gender through all aspects of our work will ensure that our efforts to counter terrorism and violent extremism support the elimination of gender-based violence. Our effectiveness will be shaped by our ability to engage with men and boys and masculine ideologies. Addressing the broader attitudes and behaviours of men and boys is essential to mitigating the gendered impacts of countering and preventing terrorism and violent extremism. Our annual counter-terrorism hui, as we call it, or large-scale meeting, brings together New Zealanders from central and local government, communities, civil society, particularly women-led organisations, the private sector and the research community. The hui provides an opportunity to discuss current issues and our collective responses. The success of our government's vision for a safe New Zealand relies on our ability to walk alongside our communities, to listen and learn from their experiences, and to keep their voices at the centre. This must deliberately include women and girls in all their diversity, and must consider gender at every stage, including via gender disaggregated data and a definition of violent extremism that takes into account gendered impacts, influences, and ideologies. As we learn from our gender diverse community in Aotearoa, we turn also to you, our international partners, including those in the Christchurch Call to Action community and beyond. Safe countries rely on safe regions and a safe world. A coordinated, gender response approach is fundamental to achieving these goals. And then, yes, with the indulgence of Madam Chair, I will speak on behalf of Canada, Australia, and my own country, New Zealand. We welcome the opportunity to discuss ways to enhance a gender-responsive approach to preventing and countering terrorism and violent extremism. Collectively, we have made substantive progress towards gender equality, but there is still a long way to go, particularly in our efforts to counter and prevent terrorism and violent extremism. It is critical we prioritise gender equality and the full, equal, and meaningful participation of our communities in this work. We know that without including women and girls in all their diversity in our efforts, whether at the national, regional, or international level, we will ultimately fail to achieve safety, social cohesion, and peace for our communities. women experience sexual and gender-based violence and discrimination in many facets of their lives, online and offline, including day-to-day harassment and intimate partner violence. When we talk about being gender responsive, we need to address these differential impacts of terrorism and violent extremism on women and girls, as well as recognise the need to also talk about men, gender stereotypes and masculinities. As we heard from experts during CT Week and in debates around the 8th review of the Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy, terrorist groups exploit gender stereotypes and masculinities, femininities, and gendered inequalities to meet their own needs. For example, misogyny underpins many white supremacist, faith-motivated, and politically motivated ideologies, which often include strictly defined gender rules and fear and hatred of LGBTQIA+ peoples. The inclusion of women and men, girls and boys, and gender-diverse people in developing gender-based approaches to counter-terrorism is key to preventing and mitigating the impacts of these acts. We must ensure the involvement of women and girls is central to these efforts, as outlined in UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and the broader Women, Peace and Security agenda. Close cooperation amongst governments, private sector and civil society, including in our work here at the UN, will be critical to achieving further progress in enhancing the capacities of all member states to ensure a gender-based approach in responding effectively to threats. Together, we are committed to building counter-terrorism and countering violent extremism work programs that are gender responsive and respect and protect all human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that first statement from New Zealand on behalf of CANS, I will now pass to the next two groups that we have, which will be the European Union, followed by Denmark on behalf of the Nordic countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Let me begin by thanking you and the co-sponsors for convening this meeting and thanking the briefers for their insightful presentations. The EU recognizes that the global effort to prevent and counter terrorism and violent extremism should entail a strong gender-responsive dimension. We should address the impact of gender stereotypes and gender-based violence on terrorism and violent extremism, while ensuring women's full, equal, and meaningful participation in the prevention and counter-terrorism efforts. The EU is therefore happy to contribute to a discussion focused on enhancing the capacities of member states to ensure a gender-responsive approach to counter-terrorism. Madam Chair, efforts over the last 2 decades, since the passing of Resolution 1325 and its introduction of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, have improved WPS policy approaches and gender mainstreaming across preventing and countering violent extremism platforms. But more research and better implementation is needed. Here are a couple of reflections from our side how to get there. First, we need to ensure that the UN system comes up with a holistic cross-sectoral approach to address the relationship between gender, peace, security, human rights, and counter-terrorism. Through our EU Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, which is going to run out in 2024, we support actions of societies and governments to engage, empower, protect, and support women and girls from diverse backgrounds. We're therefore happy to work together at the UN to ensure such a holistic approach. Secondly, we need to assess the gendered impacts of counter-terrorism measures, or else they can hit hard those most vulnerable. Operational actions to counter terrorism must be adequately considered in order to mitigate negative effects, starting from the design phase, with rigorous monitoring and evaluation, allowing for necessary adjustments throughout implementation. The same is true for criminal justice responses. The European Union has tasked Women in International Security, an independent non-profit organization, to develop guidelines for use by counter-terrorism practitioners. These guidelines promote understanding and a strategic approach to the role of women in criminal justice responses to terrorism. And third, we need to foster capacity building, including on general awareness and gender-responsive policies for security and counter-terrorism stakeholders, but also capacity building targeting women in specific counter-terrorism techniques. The EU funds a number of projects on gender-responsive local early warning systems and inclusive peace processes. As an example, the EU is supporting UN Women in the Central African Republic and Mozambique in their effort to enhance women's inclusion and integration among military actors and ensure that armed forces are better prepared to integrate a gender perspective in the planning and conduct of operations and activities. Finally, Madam Chair, the EU partnering with Egypt has set gender equality as a priority during our co-chairing of the Global Counterterrorism Forum. And the EU has also prioritized a gender-responsive approach to preventing and countering terrorism in our work at the UN, including in the recent review of the Global Counterterrorism Strategy. I thank you.
Thank you, and I'll pass the floor to the representative of Denmark to deliver a statement on behalf of the Nordic Group.
Madam Chair, distinguished delegates, colleagues, I'm delivering this statement on behalf of the Nordic countries, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and then, of course, my own country, Denmark. Let me begin by saying that we welcome today's focus on gender and the women, peace and security agenda as cross-cutting issues when addressing threats to international peace and security caused by terrorist acts. Let me also start by thanking Malta for your leadership on this important file, and then, of course, thank the distinguished briefers for their remarks and for setting the scene for today's important discussion. Chair, colleagues, terrorism and violent extremism have different impacts and consequences for women and girls. Many terrorist groups exploit and fuel gender inequalities to radicalize and recruit new members. Some groups use sexual and gender-based violence as an integral part of efforts to terrorize civilians and destroy the social fabric of communities and the lives of individuals. Colleagues, a whole-of-society approach to preventing and countering terrorism and violent extremism requires the meaningful participation of women-led civil society organizations, because insights, contributions, and recommendations of women activists are essential to the full implementation of the UN Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy. Yet, all over the world, democracy is losing ground, and the civic space for women's rights organizations, women human rights defenders, and women peace builders is shrinking, impeding effective responses to the rising threat of terrorism. Not only are women-led civil society organizations and women human rights defenders often left out of policy processes in the counter-terrorism space. In his report on the implementation of the UN Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy from this year, the Secretary General found that in some contexts, states routinely misuse counter-terrorism measures and legislation to systematically target women advocating for equality and defending their human rights. As member states, we must enhance our efforts to ensure that our national, regional, and global counter-terrorism efforts not only integrate a gender analysis, but also have the safeguarding of human rights and fundamental freedoms as their foundation. Now, in promoting gender-responsive approaches to counter-terrorism, the Nordic countries would like to emphasize the following 3 points. First, when we develop, implement, and evaluate measures to counter terrorism and violent extremism, it is imperative that we ensure the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women at all levels and assess and mitigate potentially harmful impacts to civil society and women. Genuinely representative and inclusive processes contribute to local ownership and gender transformative efforts, including an understanding of the many different roles of women as peace builders, community leaders, and survivors, as well as enablers or perpetrators of terrorism and violent extremism. Second, we need to counter the pushback against women human rights defenders and peace builders. And we must quite simply raise the cost of all types of reprisals against women activists through robust accountability measures. It is our collective responsibility to put an end to such threats and to hold perpetrators accountable. And finally, Terrorist organizations' use of sexual and gender-based violence as a strategy and tactic must be targeted and countered, and the perpetrators must be brought to justice. Now, this entails developing and making use of robust accountability measures. It also entails preventative measures, such as making more effective use of the Security Council's sanctions regime to list those designated terrorist organizations that are known perpetrators of conflict-related sexual violence, including as put forward yearly in the annex of the report of the Secretary General. In short, and in conclusion, 1, ensure the meaningful participation of women in the design of counter-terrorism measures. 2, clamp down on reprisals against women activists working in the counter-terrorism space. And 3, target and counter terrorist organizations' use of sexual and gender-based violence. I thank you.
I now pass the floor to our next speaker this afternoon, the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms whilst countering terrorism. Hanula, I can't pronounce your surname, I'm sorry. And since we always use first names, it's a terrible thing we do at the UN. I apologize. I'm not going to try and pronounce it. You will soon complete your mandate as Special Rapporteur, so I want to take this opportunity to congratulate you on all your work over the past 6 years, including on gender and counterterrorism. Last week's award from the CSO Coalition on Human Rights and Counterterrorism was a fitting tribute to your efforts in this sphere. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador. Irish names are always a mouthful, especially long ones. So, Madam Chair, briefers and excellencies, I really welcome the leadership of Malta and the co-sponsors of this Arria Formula meeting on the importance of gender in efforts to prevent and counter terrorism. It's a fitting meeting to end my time here in New York. As many are aware, my mandate launched a global study on the impact of counter-terrorism measures on civil society and civic space last week during High Level Week. And in doing so, in this study, what I think I've documented is the historical targeting of women, LGBTQ and gender diverse persons under the guise of conformity with UN counterterrorism. I think one of the things that study does is that it evidences the scale and the scope of harms to women and girls assisted and enabled by counterterrorism and security discourses. And what do we know from that? Well, what we know is that women and girls and LGBTQ and gender diverse persons are directly harmed every day as they work in their communities, their organizations, and their families as they fight for the most essential of rights. And none of this under the guise of counterterrorism makes women, girls, men or boys safer or more secure. So therefore, I urge Council members, when considering the obligations to mainstream gender and women's rights in all peace and security efforts, to do so rooted in the prevention agenda, the essential prevention agenda, and the decades of work that the Women, Peace and Security agenda in the Council has undertaken, which is complex, intersectional analysis of gendered and layered inequality. That must be mainstreamed here. As many have stated before me, the Women, Peace and Security agenda is not about making war or armed conflict safer for women. That's not its purpose. But it's about preventing such conflict altogether and dealing with root causes. And that should be precisely the same principle through which the Council and Member States address gender mainstreaming and women's rights in efforts to prevent and counter terrorism. I'll close by drawing your attention to one particular case where the dynamics of binaries and rights marginalization on the basis of gender persist, namely the continued large-scale arbitrary detention of over 60,000 women and children in Al-Hol and Al-Raj camps in northeast Syria, and in parallel, the de facto categorization of men and boys as high risk simply because of their gender. I call on the Council and the broader UN member states to ensure that gender mainstreaming and women's rights are simply not co-opted to enforce decades of misuse of counterterrorism and preventing violent extremism and measures. And what we have to do is to ensure that this binary narratives no longer continue to fuel what is a limited threat analysis and response to the problem we have at hand. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now move to the members of the General Assembly. Again, I would like to remind you to keep your interventions as brief as possible so that we can maximize participation. We have 40 minutes left and 10 speakers, so we should be fine. I pass the floor now to the representative of Malaysia.
Thank you, Chair. Malaysia would like to convey our appreciation to Malta and fellow co-sponsors for convening this important meeting and the briefers for their valuable insights. Today's briefing reaffirms that the elevated threat of terrorism continues to be a grave concern. Malaysia joins other delegations in strongly condemning terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, irrespective of where, when, or whoever commits it. Violence, extremism, and radicalism have no place in our society. Hence, the fight against terrorism is one that necessitates collective efforts under various frameworks through bilateral, regional, and international cooperation. In this regard, Malaysia welcomes the consensual adoption of Resolution 77/298 on the 8th review of the GCTS on 22nd June 2023. Madam Chair, at the national level, Malaysia's primary counter-terrorism efforts focus on preventive and prescriptive measures. These include countering the narratives of terrorists and extremists, carrying out programs aimed at de-radicalization, rehabilitation, and reintegration of former foreign terrorist fighters. These measures are an integral part of Malaysia's comprehensive national security policy, which advocates for moderation, peaceful coexistence, and peace building in countering extremism, terrorism, and radicalization. Through our own Southeast Asia Regional Center for Counter-Terrorism, or CIARSAT, Malaysia has embarked into a study on women and terrorism since 2016. This study aims to create a better understanding on the factors that pushed Malaysian women to join terrorist groups. For the majority of them, the factors include various socio-political, economic, and personal situations. Against this backdrop, CIARSAT has conducted 2 roundtable discussions on gendered approach towards outreach on radicalization, or GATOR, to enhance engagement between government agencies and civil societies. Through these discussions, we strive to develop a more gender-sensitive prevent and counter violent extremism strategies in Malaysia. Madam Chair, in line with Security Council Resolution 1325, Malaysia equally recognizes the critical role played by women in the maintenance and promotion of peace and security, including in counter-terrorism efforts. We further believe in applying a gender lens approach in formulating and implementing effective strategies to prevent and combat terrorism in accordance with relevant Security Council resolutions. Malaysia believes that the promotion of gender parity conduces to a reduction in risks of radicalization and extremism. Understanding the psyche of gendered incentives and vulnerabilities can further help explain radicalization routes and improve preventive measures. Malaysia, in this regard, stands ready to extend its cooperation within the United Nations framework in the efforts to prevent and eliminate terrorism. I thank you.
Thank you. I now pass the floor to the representative of Congo. I'm not sure if they're in the room because their nameplate is empty. No, then I will pass to the next speaker, the representative of Morocco. Okay, so we'll go to the next, representative of Ireland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Ireland thanks Malta for organising this Arria Formula meeting and for bringing this topic to the Council's attention. Ireland also thanks the briefers for their informative presentations and the Member States who've co-sponsored this meeting. Ireland aligns itself with the statement made on behalf of the European Union and its Member States. Throughout Ireland's term on the Security Council, before and since, Ireland has underscored the importance of a gender-responsive CT approach. Such approaches not only promote gender equality, they also strengthen the effectiveness of CT efforts. The full, equal and meaningful participation of women in counter-terrorism processes as well as engagement with women's human rights and civil society organisations, is therefore paramount. Ireland also acknowledges and thanks the Special Rapporteur, Fionnuala Ní Éileán, for her work on this topic. Madam Chair, sexual and gender-based violence are part of the strategic objectives and ideology of terrorist groups, violence that disproportionately affects women and girls. Such violence includes abductions, early enforced marriages, rape, sexual slavery, human trafficking, and attacks on women, human rights defenders. Unfortunately, accountability for sexual and gender-based violence perpetrated by terrorists against women and girls is often lacking. Ireland expresses strong support for CTED's ongoing work in this space and for the work undertaken by the Special Representative of the Secretary-General for Sexual Violence and Conflict. As has already been highlighted this afternoon, Ireland would also agree that for counter-terrorism responses to be effective, we should advance a more holistic understanding of gender, including through the consideration of masculinities. We are all aware that terrorist groups use stereotypes of masculinity and men's powers to radicalise and recruit men. Biased presumptions of men and boys in conflict zones as combatants undermines their human rights and disregards the many roles men play in effective prevention efforts. It can also lead to a lack of understanding about men, including gay, bisexual and transgender men, as victims of terrorism. Allow me to conclude, Madam Chair, by thanking you once again for furthering and promoting understanding of this important topic and reiterating Ireland's support for this Arria meeting.
Thank you. I pass the floor now to the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to begin by thanking Malta and co-sponsor for convening this important meeting. I also thank all the briefers for their enlightening briefings. Madam Chair, first of all, my delegation strongly condemns any attempt by terrorist individuals and groups exploiting gender to further their goals, including the use of sexual and gender-based violence as a tactic of terrorism. At the same time, we recognize the varied roles of women and girls in the context of violent extremism and terrorism. They can be victims of terrorism actors who prevent and counter violent extremism and perpetrators of terrorism acts. Given this, we cannot expect to effectively respond to terrorism and extreme violence without first integrating gender perspective into counterterrorism efforts. Madam Chair, despite the ongoing effort of the Member States and the United Nations, acts of sexual and gender-based violence and human trafficking in terrorism context have not abated considerably, while countries fail to nurture the full potential of women as agents in CT and PVCE for various reasons. These include lack of capacity, lack of special expertise, and sometimes lack of political will of stakeholders. To respond to such challenges, we should identify and address the underlying gender-related structural factors and simultaneously recognize the vital role of women and girls in countering terrorism and empower them to actively participate in counterterrorism institutions. Madam Chair, all of these measures are only possible when the Member States and UN entities redouble their efforts in raising awareness of gender as a cross-cutting issue through our CT and PVCE activities and strengthening the capacity of Member States, particularly in developing gender-responsive legislations and criminal justice systems. Madam Chair, the Republic of Korea has made efforts to faithfully implement UN Security Council resolutions on WPS. We have also established and implemented 3 national action plans and have been hosting annual international conference on WPS. The Korean government is also conducting gender impact analysis in key policy areas and has introduced gender perspectives in the decision-making process for security affairs. In addition, the Republic of Korea's National Plan of Action for Preventing Violent Extremism has included promoting gender equality and participation of women as an effective way to prevent violent extremism. As an incoming Security Council member, we will continue to engage various international efforts to integrate gender perspectives into counterterrorism. I thank you.
Thank you. I now pass the floor to the representative of Chile.
Señora Presidenta.
Madam Chair, Chile would like to thank Malta and the other co-sponsors for convening this meeting. We take note of the briefings and the contributions heard today. We thank the briefers and the other members for those. We believe that it's fundamental to address the gender perspective comprehensively in counterterrorism. Structural gender inequalities lead to unequal power dynamics that can then in turn lead on to the perpetration of abuse that in many cases goes unpunished. Indeed, sexual and gender-based violence that is used as a weapon of war in armed conflicts that terrorize civilian populations is a violation of human rights and must be appropriately addressed. In addition, the use of explosives in areas inhabited by terrorist groups has a disproportionate impact on women and children. For this reason, we've reiterated that it's imperative for this Security Council to guarantee that all peacekeeping operations have personnel trained in gender and also in prevention and response to gender-based sexual violence. This would give clear protection to those needing it and would be a first step towards empowering them and ensuring their meaningful participation. Moreover, we should be encouraging women's participation in the field and promoting women's leadership at all levels of the multilateral system. It's fundamental that we educate and raise awareness regarding preventing and combating violent extremism. This is key to avoid populations being recruited by extremist groups. However, we know that sometimes such recruitment is by force or driven by a lack of alternatives. That's why we should be shoring up our gender-based analysis as it pertains to radicalization and recruitment. Furthermore, we should encourage these prevention efforts so that they include capacity building and strengthening for local communities and civil society, because these groups best understand the opportunities and the challenges facing the inhabitants of those same areas, and so that we can empower them to combat violence. I mustn't forget to mention that a gender-based response mustn't omit the situation of the LGBTI communities. Here, in particular, we recall the Arria Formula meeting co-organized on the 24th of August 2015 by Chile and the United States. At that meeting, this issue was discussed for the first time in the Security Council, and we discussed the Daesh attacks on persons in that group. To conclude, we underscore that only a strategic counterterrorism strategy and approach that mainstreams the gender perspective and includes women in its diagnosis, planning and development will lead us to achieving sustainable and inclusive peace and more equal societies. Thank you.
Thank you. I now pass the floor to the representative of Italy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Italy welcomes this Arria Formula meeting aimed at ensuring a greater integration of the United Nations and Member States' agendas on women, peace and security, counter-terrorism and countering violent extremism in line with the UN Security Council Resolution 2242/2015. This discussion is particularly meaningful and timely in light of the adoption of the consensus by the General Assembly on the 22nd of June of the 8th review of the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy, a crucial document to guide our individual and collective efforts to promote peace and security. This new resolution has recognized the important contribution to the counter-terrorism efforts by the civil society actors, in line with the whole of society approach. In particular, we welcome the new reference in the strategy to the role played by women-led civil society organizations as a step in the right direction, that to uphold the full, equal and meaningful participation and leadership of women also in the efforts to prevent and counter terrorism and violent extremism. Their effective inclusion should further enhance our capacity to achieve the goals of the strategy. From an operational perspective, all the member states have been called to highlight the important role of women in countering terrorism and violent extremism. Furthermore, member states and United Nations entities have been urged to consider the specific impacts of counter-terrorism strategies on women and women's organizations, and to seek greater consultations with them when developing strategies to prevent and counter terrorism. Participation is indeed a key pillar of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Madam Chair, in our national experience to counter terrorism and respond to its threat, we have directly witnessed the crucial role that women play in building the social fabric, in education, in mediation, as well in assuming and responsibility roles in operations at different levels. In the early 60s, Italian women have been eligible to assess the national exams to join the law enforcement agencies, the police, as well as the judiciary. Today, many high-rank officials are women. In the Italian judiciary, the majority of positions are occupied by women. Women in judiciary represent the 54%. Their presence and contribution to the fight against terrorism in the specialized units are crucial. In order to build a gender-responsive approach to counterterrorism, we need to collectively engage and exchange experiences aimed at reinforcing our capacity to respond to the gendered dynamics underpinning terrorism and violent extremism and strengthening the rule of law and accountability in this context. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Italy and pass the floor to the representative of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Madam President. And let me start by expressing our appreciation to you, to Malta, and all the co-sponsors for initiating this Arria Formula meeting, and by thanking the briefers for their presentations. The Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the statement earlier made by the European Union, and I would like to add just a few remarks in my national capacity. As a country with a feminist foreign policy, the Kingdom of the Netherlands strongly believes that applying a gender perspective is a prerequisite for successful and sustainable solutions to matters of peace and security. And this also includes policies and practices that aim to prevent and counter violent extremism conducive to terrorism. For such interventions to be effective, equitable and just, they must be gender responsive. Allow me to highlight 3 points. First, we should use the practical guidance and tools that already exist for gender responsive CT. A concrete example of this is the Gender and PCVE Policy Toolkit that was developed by the Global Centre of Cooperative Security with support of the governments of Australia and Indonesia. The toolkit gives concrete guidelines on how PCVE interventions can be more gender responsive. For instance, by integrating the principles of non-discrimination and equality, by organizing gender responsive stakeholder engagement, and by removing barriers to ensure the participation and leadership of diverse women and structurally excluded groups. Second, the need for gender-sensitive analysis. This is important to better understand if and how men, women, and people of diverse gender identities follow different pathways, both when it comes to engaging in violence and joining and supporting terrorist groups, as well as when it comes to become victims of terrorist and violent extremist action. Our policies and interventions should subsequently be informed by these analyses. An example of this is our national policy for detention and reintegration. We take the special needs of female foreign terrorist fighters into account when it comes to our detention, reintegration, and intervention programs. Third, violent extremism and terrorism should be considered within a broader human rights context, as well as in relation to power dynamics and gender inequality. For instance, there is increasing awareness about the use of sexual and gender-based violence as a recruitment and terrorism tactic. This type of violence can also be an indicator of the spread of violent extremism conducive to terrorism and the acceptance of violence in a society. Finally, our CT and CVE efforts should be strongly linked and integrated with the WPS agenda and should consistently apply a gender-responsive approach. We look forward to working closely with all relevant partners on this, and I thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Netherlands and pass the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, we would like to thank Malta and the co-sponsoring states for organizing today's most pertinent debate. Slovenia aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union, and I would like to add a few remarks in our national capacity. The evolving threat of terrorism and of violent extremism in all their forms and irrespective of their origin continues to pose a major risk to all of us. We should respond to it holistically, not relying purely on military and security action, but also by addressing the root causes. Respect for human rights and the rule of law, including due process and fair trial guarantees, must be the bedrock of this fight. Efforts to combat terrorism must be gender responsive and human rights compliant. Greater efforts are needed to integrate adequate human rights safeguards into development, implementation, and monitoring of evidence-based counter-terrorism policies and measures. A whole-of-society approach is another prerequisite for effective and sustainable efforts to prevent and counter terrorism and violent extremism. The UN Security Council Resolution 2617 has reaffirmed the need to increase attention to women in all work on threats to international peace and security caused by terrorist acts. Meaningful engagement with civil society, including women's organizations, must also be a part of this holistic approach. Slovenia remains committed to the advancement of gender equality and women's empowerment as one of its long-standing priorities. When adopting our first national strategy on terrorism and violent extremism prevention, a gender perspective, including the role of women and family in curbing radicalization, especially in the rehabilitation and reintegration of young people, has been taken into account as well. Terrorism and violent extremism conducive to terrorism have differential gendered impacts, and women are being disproportionately affected. Sexual and gender-based violence is used as a tactic of terrorism. Women may also face gender-specific difficulties when attempting to access justice and seeking remedies as victims of terrorism. We underline the importance of timely support for victims and survivors of terrorist attacks and abuse, in particular to women and girls survivors of sexual violence. The support should include comprehensive health services. Responses to terrorism can impact women differently. Women bring different perspectives, experiences, and solutions to policymaking. For this reason, policies, laws, and criminal justice procedures that are informed by the experiences and concerns of women, including gender-sensitive investigation and prosecution approaches, must be put in place. Madam President, gender-responsive approaches are essential not only in assessing and responding to the impacts of counter-terrorism measures on women and girls, but to strengthening the effectiveness of prevention and counter-terrorism efforts and respect for human rights. Effective measures to prevent and counter terrorism and respect for human rights, fundamental freedoms, and the rule of law are complementary, mutually reinforcing, and constitute an essential part of successful counter-terrorism efforts. I thank you.
Thank you, and I now pass the floor to the representative of Indonesia.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity given. I would like to begin by appreciating Malta and other co-sponsors for convening this area formula meeting. Indonesia shares the view of other participants of the Arria formula that it is important to develop gender-sensitive approach towards countering violent extremism and measures to counter terrorism. In our experience, women play a significant role with regard to violent extremisms. Women can take role as mitigators, victims, or even perpetrators. Women are also important as messengers on this effort to counter terrorism in houses, schools, and religious institutions. In our part, gender mainstreaming and empowerment has been an integral part of Indonesia's national action plan to prevent and counter violent extremism, which take the whole of government and whole of society approach, including, among others, strengthening collaboration with women leaders and CSOs in assisting local governments in improving literacy and counter-narratives to build community and family resilience. Madam Chair, in context of ASEAN in our region, ASEAN member states has established the ASEAN Plan of Action to prevent and counter the rise of radicalization and violent extremism, and the Bali Work Plan 2019-2025 as its implementing framework, which also covers the efforts to empower women and promote gender equality to enhance the capacity, participation, and leadership of women in the promotion of moderation and tolerance to prevent the rise of radicalization and violent extremism. Several activities that I can share, including addressing local grievances and altering radical narratives, identifying paths to violence that they take, encouraging support systems for women, as well as promoting gender mainstreaming to prevent countering the rise of radicalization. Moreover, Madam Chair, under the Global Counter-Terrorism Forum, together with Australia's and other members, Indonesia has launched a toolkit to provide practical guidance to gender-sensitive approaches in countering violent extremism, which aim to assist in designing, implementing, monitoring, and evaluating programs to strengthen CVE efforts, taking into account the gendered aspects of engagement in violent extremism and approaches to prevent and counter violent extremism. Indonesia looks forward to strengthening cooperation with member states as well as the UN and other relevant stakeholders in these collective efforts. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I now pass the floor to the last speaker on our list, the representative of Bangladesh.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I thank Malta and co-sponsoring countries for organizing this important meeting. I also thank all the briefers for their insightful presentations today. Excellencies, Bangladesh maintains a policy of zero tolerance towards terrorism and violent extremism in all its forms and manifestations. Under the dynamic leadership of Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, Bangladesh has achieved notable success in combating terrorism and violent extremism. While addressing this challenge, our government has maintained a strong focus on the gender dimensions of terrorism and violent extremism. Apart from the protection of women and girls from disproportionate impact of terrorism, our efforts include promotion of women's participation in preventing and countering this threat. Our National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, adopted in 2019, considers terrorism and violent extremism as a key context for implementation of this important agenda. We have taken a whole-of-society approach in tackling violent extremism, where women are considered as key actors for prevention. We have also increased women's participation in security sector, including in entities tackling terrorism and violent extremism. Bangladesh has also been a key partner of the Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund, GSARF, which has been working with women and youth-led society organizations to prevent spread of extremist ideologies. Allow me to highlight a few more points regarding today's discussion. First, we welcome the crucial steps taken to ensure a gender-responsive approach to counter-terrorism at Pillars 3 and 4 of the 8th review of the Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy adopted by the General Assembly on June 22, 2023. During the implementation stage of this strategy, we call upon UN Global Coordination Compact entities and member states to work together for development, funding, and implementation of women-inclusive capacity-building projects in order to mobilize a stronger and more systematic gender-responsive approach to terrorism at the national, regional, and global levels. Furthermore, we emphasize the importance of sharing best practices on successful implementation of gender-responsive policies, and we encourage all stakeholders to provide capacity-building support for the introduction and implementation of these projects in countries in need. Second, we recognize the need for gathering sex-disaggregated data on the drivers of radicalization and on the impacts of counter-terrorism strategies on women's human rights and women's organizations as urged in the resolution 2242. In this regard, we acknowledge the establishment of a human rights and gender section at the United Nations Office of Counter-Terrorism in January 22 in order to ensure gender-responsive and human rights complaints approaches to preventing and countering terrorism. Third, it is of utmost importance to reinforce accountability mechanisms within national policies to ensure effective integration of women in counterterrorism strategies and policies. Equally important is to strengthen the justice system to address impacts of terrorism on women. In this regard, we emphasize the need to build the capacity of security and justice sector institutions at the national level to incorporate a gender-responsive approach to counterterrorism. I thank you all.
Thank you. Colleagues, we have now reached the end of today's Arria Formula meeting. We would kindly ask all delegates to send their written statements to our email address, unsc.newyork@gov.mt, for inclusion in our compilation of statements, which we will circulate to UN member states in the coming weeks. A recording of today's meeting will also be made available on Wednesday through our social media channels. I want to thank you all for your participation, particularly our briefers, Deputy Executive Director Hendricks, Alexandra Deer, Stephen Hill, and Miss Ali. I would like to thank also our co-sponsors, the Secretariat, the technicians, and the interpreters. As we have heard today, there is clear support for, and I would add an expectation, to operationalize a more gender-responsive approach to preventing and countering terrorism and violent extremism. I want to thank you all for sharing your thoughts and reflections, as well as your practical ideas and recommendations this afternoon. I can conclude by saying that while we have achieved a lot in this sphere over the past decade, we still have more to do. Malta looks forward to working with you all during the next 18 months on our Security Council tenure to make the vision of a more gender-responsive, human rights-compliant approach to counter-terrorism a reality. Thank you all again for staying with us till the end of the meeting, particularly after a very busy CT week. Enjoy your evening. Thank you.